To understand why British snipers were struggling in 1944, we have to look past the nostalgia and examine the machine itself. The Lee-Enfield had served the British Empire since 1895, earning a near mythical reputation for its smooth bolt action and 10-round magazine capacity, double that of the German Mauser. It was the weapon that made the Mad Minute possible, a feat where a trained soldier could send 30 aimed shots downrange in 60 seconds. For half a century, this rifle was the backbone of British infantry power, celebrated because it was fast, reliable, and incredibly robust. But therein lay the deadly paradox that haunted the hedgerows of Normandy. The very traits that made the Enfield a trench warfare legend made it a liability for the precision work of a sniper. The standard trigger was a deliberate military compromise, engineered to function without fail in the mud of Flanders, the sands of North Africa, and the freezing cold of the Arctic. It wasn't built for the delicate geometry of a 600-yard headshot. It was built to go bang when covered in filth. The trigger pull weight varied wildly between 5 and 7 pounds, depending on the luck of the draw in manufacturing. Worse, it featured what gunsmiths call a two-stage military pull, dominated by substantial creep. This was that gritty, grinding sensation the sniper felt as the trigger moved rearward, catching and dragging before the sear finally released. For a line infantryman suppressing an enemy charge at 200 yards, this grittiness was acceptable. For a sniper trying to thread a bullet through a loophole at 600 yards, it was catastrophic. When the British Army began converting standard Enfields into dedicated sniper rifles in 1942, they added superior optics and selected the most accurate barrels, yet they left these gritty, unpredictable triggers completely standard. The reasoning from the top brass was simple, and in their eyes, absolute. A rifle that fires every time is superior to a rifle that shoots accurately only some of the time. They believed trigger modifications would compromise the weapon's legendary reliability. And to be fair to the establishment, they had tried to fix it. In 1943, armorers at the Small Arms School at Hythe experimented with reducing pull weights by weakening springs and polishing sear surfaces. The results were disastrous. Lighter triggers led to misfires in cold weather, and polished sears caused rifles to slam fire, discharging accidentally when the bolt was closed sharply. This terrifying malfunction killed 2 soldiers during testing. Terrified by these accidents, Lieutenant Colonel Nade Armstrong, the chief instructor at Hythe, issued a directive in August 1943 that solidified the deadly status quo. The order was explicit. No modifications to trigger assemblies are authorized. The doctrine stated that the standard mechanism represented the optimal balance between reliability and accuracy. The expert consensus was clear. The trigger could not be improved without sacrificing safety. Consequently, British snipers were told to simply adapt their technique. But in the physics of long-range ballistics, technique cannot overcome a mechanical flaw. While the experts in England debated safety protocols, men in Normandy were dying because their rifles were fighting them every time they tried to take a shot. To understand why British snipers were struggling in 1944, we first must dismantle a legend. The Lee-Enfield rifle had served the British Empire faithfully since 1895, earning a near mythical reputation for its smooth bolt action and 10-round magazine capacity, double that of the German Kar98ks. It was the weapon that made the Mad Minute famous, a training standard where a soldier could fire 30 aimed shots in 60 seconds. For half a century, this rifle was the backbone of British infantry power, because it was fast, reliable, and robust. But therein lay the deadly paradox that haunted the hedgerows of Normandy. The very traits that made the Enfield a trench warfare legend made it a liability for the precision work of a sniper. The standard trigger was a deliberate military compromise, engineered to function without fail in the mud of Flanders, the sands of North Africa, and the freezing cold of the Arctic. It wasn't built for the delicate geometry of a 600-yard headshot. It was built to go bang when covered in filth.
The mechanical reality of the standard Lee-Enfield trigger was a nightmare for precision shooting. The pull weight varied wildly between 5 and 7 pounds, depending on manufacturing tolerances. Worse, it featured what gunsmiths call a two-stage military pull, dominated by substantial creep. This was a greedy, grinding sensation the sniper felt as the trigger moved rearward, catching and dragging before the sear finally released. For rapid fire at 200 yards, this was acceptable. For precision shooting at 600 yards, it was catastrophic. While the British struggled with this grit, their German counterparts were equipped with Kar98ks rifles fitted with precision single-stage triggers. This allowed German snipers to achieve first-shot hits at ranges where Commonwealth snipers needed 2 or 3 attempts. The tactical consequences of this mechanical disparity were brutal. In sniper warfare, the second shot is often fatal, not to the enemy, but to the shooter. The muzzle flash from a missed first shot gives away your position, inviting return fire. The statistics from Normandy were damning. German snipers averaged 1.3 shots per kill, while British snipers averaged 2.8. By mid-June 1944, British sniper teams were suffering 40% higher casualties than their German counterparts. In the first 2 weeks of the campaign alone, after-action reports documented 73 British sniper casualties in the sector, compared to just 31 German losses. Despite the slaughter, the British military establishment remained paralyzed by a binary mindset. They viewed trigger design as a strict choice between reliability and precision. When the army began converting Enfields into sniper rifles in 1942, they selected accurate barrels and added scopes, but left the triggers standard. The small arms school at Height had previously attempted to lighten triggers by weakening springs and polishing sears, but the experiments ended in disaster when rifles slam-fired, discharged accidentally upon closing the bolt, killing 2 soldiers. This trauma led to a rigid doctrine. No modifications to trigger assemblies are authorized. The experts believed the problem was unsolvable without compromising safety. They were wrong. While the casualty reports mounted in Normandy, the solution to the sniper's dilemma was being engineered not in a high-tech government laboratory, but in a quiet basement workshop in Portsmouth, 200 miles away from the front lines. Harold Bowman was not a military man, and he held no engineering degree from Cambridge or the Royal Technical College. His credentials consisted of 34 years of practical experience running a small gun shop on Queen Street, where he spent his days repairing shotguns for farmers and tuning target rifles for competitive shooters. It was this civilian background that allowed him to see what the military experts had missed. While the armorers at the small arms school saw the trigger problem as a binary choice between reliability and precision, believing you could only have one or the other, Bowman understood that it was actually a problem of geometry and leverage. Bowman's epiphany occurred in May 1944, sparked by a routine repair job on a pre-war target rifle for a local shooting club. As he examined the weapon, he noticed it featured a 2-stage trigger similar to the military Lee-Enfield, but with a critical modification: an adjustable screw that altered the engagement angle between the trigger and the sear. This simple mechanism allowed the trigger to break cleanly at a light 2 pounds of pressure, yet, and this was the key, it maintained full surface engagement for safety until the moment of firing. Intrigued, Bowman retreated to the back room of his workshop and retrieved his personal Lee-Enfield, a surplus rifle he had purchased in 1938. For the next 6 hours, he meticulously disassembled and measured the trigger assembly, looking at the mechanism through the eyes of a geometrician rather than a soldier. He analyzed the standard hook and notch design used by the British Army. He discovered that the standard trigger lever engaged the sear at a shallow angle of roughly 35 degrees.
This 35-degree angle was the fatal flaw in the geometry of the rifle. Because the angle was so shallow, the trigger had to travel a significant distance rearward to disengage the sear. As the sniper pulled, the metal surfaces ground against each other under the tension of the mainspring. This friction created the infamous creep, that gritty, unpredictable movement that ruined aim. It forced the shooter to apply increasing pressure while unsure of exactly when the rifle would fire. In the split-second tension of a sniper duel, that uncertainty was deadly. Bowman calculated that if he could steepen that engagement angle from 35 degrees to 60 degrees, the physics of the trigger would fundamentally change. At 60 degrees, the mechanical disadvantage was removed. The trigger would no longer need to drag the sear off the ledge. Instead, it would release it with minimal travel. This geometric shift would allow for a crisp glass-like break at a reduced pull weight, eliminating the creep entirely. Most importantly, this design maintained the full depth of the sear engagement, meaning the rifle remained drop-safe and reliable. Most importantly, this design maintained the full depth of the sear engagement, meaning the rifle remained drop-safe and reliable in rough conditions. The military armorers had tried to lighten triggers by polishing surfaces, making them slippery and dangerous, or weakening springs, causing misfires. Bowman solved the problem by simply changing the angle of attack. The modification itself was shockingly simple. It required machining a new notch into the trigger lever and installing a small adjustment screw to lock the geometry in place. Bowman calculated the total cost of the parts at just 3 shillings and the labor time at 45 minutes per rifle. On May 23, 1944, he applied this theory to his own rifle. The verification came the next morning at a local shooting range. Bowman set up a target at 100 yards. With the standard trigger, his typical group size, the spread of 5 consecutive shots, was 2.3 inches. He settled behind the modified rifle, acquired the target, and squeezed. The trigger broke cleanly, without the grinding creep he was used to. He fired 5 rounds. When he walked downrange to check the target, the group measured just 0.8 inches. In a single morning, a civilian gunsmith had improved the inherent accuracy of the British Empire's service rifle by 65%. He had done it not with new technology or expensive materials, but by correcting a 25-degree error in geometry. He had turned a battle axe into a scalpel. But as Bowman would soon learn, solving the mechanical problem was the easy part. Convincing the British War Office to admit they were wrong would be a battle of a different kind. Harold Bowman, a man of precise action, wasted no time. On May 23, 1944, the very day he validated his design at the range, he sat down and penned a detailed letter to the War Office. He included his technical drawings, his firing test results, and a clear explanation of the geometric principles involved. He wasn't asking for money, he was offering a lifeline to the men preparing to invade Europe. He expected, if not gratitude, at least a professional evaluation. What he received 3 weeks later was a lesson in institutional arrogance. It was a form letter, signed by a low-level clerk. The response dryly thanked him for his patriotic interest, but informed him that all matters relating to service rifle modifications are handled by qualified military armorers. It was a polite but firm dismissal. No one with actual technical knowledge had even looked at his proposal. To the War Office, Bowman was just another meddling civilian tinkerer unaware of the complexities of military service. They assumed that the Lee-Enfield trigger could be improved. Their experts at the small arms school would have done it already.
Harold Bowman, however, was not a man to accept a brush-off when lives were at stake. On June 15, 1944, 9 days after the D-Day landings, the reality of the war hit home. Bowman opened his morning newspaper to find a grim report on British casualties in Normandy. The article specifically mentioned the 51st Highland Division, a unit Bowman knew well. He knew they had trained at a camp near Aldershot, a mere 45 miles from his shop in Portsmouth. The disconnect between the bureaucratic rejection letter on his desk and the dying men in the newspaper was too much to bear. Bowman realized that sending more letters would only result in more delays. He decided to bypass the entire chain of command. The next morning, he closed his shop on Queen Street, locked the door, and loaded 5 of his modified triggers into his car. Driving to the Aldershot military camp, Bowman was a 52-year-old civilian trying to breach a fortress of military protocol. The guard at the gate was unimpressed by a gunsmith in civilian clothes, demanding to see the chief sniper instructor. But Bowman possessed a stubborn persistence. He refused to leave. He waited at the gate for 4 agonizing hours, until finally, a young officer named Lieutenant James Fraser agreed to see him, mostly just to get rid of the nuisance at the gate. It was a desperate, unauthorized gamble that could have ended with Bowman being escorted off the base by military police. Instead, it set the stage for one of the most critical confrontations of the war. The confrontation in the conference room of the 51st Highland Division headquarters on June 18, 1944, was the turning point. The room contained 12 men, Lieutenant Colonel Campbell, his sniper instructors, skeptical armorers from the small arms school at Hive, and a resistant major from the War Office Procurement Division.
The atmosphere was hostile. Major Thornton from the War Office argued that civilian proposals were routinely rejected for good reason: safety. Warrant Officer Davies, an armorer with 18 years of experience, insisted that increasing the engagement angle would cause wear and malfunctions in the mud of Normandy. He argued that a trigger working in a clean workshop would fail in a trench, potentially getting a soldier killed. But the combat veterans in the room had a different perspective. Sergeant William Reed, fresh from Normandy, stood up and cut through the technical jargon. He described watching German snipers hit targets on the first shot, while his men needed 3 attempts, often paying for the second attempt with their lives. If this modification works, Reed said, we need it now. When Major Thornton tried to cite the 6 to 8 month timeline for official evaluation, the room almost erupted. Colonel Campbell silenced the debate with a command decision that risked his career. He authorized an immediate, unauthorized field trial. Bowman was to modify 50 rifles. If they passed a torture test, they would go straight to Normandy with the next rotation. I'm not sending my snipers back to Normandy with inferior equipment while we wait for bureaucrats to schedule meetings. For the next 2 weeks, Bowman worked 16-hour days in a workshop at Aldershot. The testing that followed was brutal, designed to make the modification fail. The rifles were submerged in mud, frozen overnight, heated to 120 degrees, and dropped from 6 feet onto concrete. The results silenced every critic. The modified rifles fired 500 rounds without cleaning and suffered 0 malfunctions. Accuracy testing showed the modified rifles averaged 1.22-inch groups at 200 yards, compared to the standard 2.4-inch groups. Even Warrant Officer Davies had to concede. By every principle I know, this shouldn't be reliable, but the testing doesn't lie. On July 5th, those 50 rifles were issued to the 51st Highland Division snipers. Each one bore a discrete stamp on the trigger guard, HB. By July 12th, they were on the front line near Esquay, Normandy.
This is where the theoretical became visceral. Sergeant William Reed, the same man who had argued for the rifles in the conference room, found himself lying in a shallow scrape behind a hedgerow. He was observing a German position in a farmhouse 520 yards away. For 3 hours, he had watched a German sniper and a spotter direct mortar fire that had already killed 4 British soldiers. At 520 yards with a standard Lee-Enfield, a first-round hit on a human-sized target was a statistical improbability. The creep in the trigger usually caused the barrel to shift slightly at the moment of firing. Reed settled his crosshairs on the German sniper's chest. He began the squeeze. The difference was instantaneous. The trigger broke cleanly at 2.8 pounds. No creep, no stacking, no warning. Because the break was crisp and light, Reed didn't flinch or anticipate the recoil. The rifle fired exactly where he was aiming. Through his scope, he watched the German sniper collapse backward. 5 seconds later, the spotter appeared to help his fallen comrade. Reed fired again. The second shot, at 525 yards, dropped the spotter instantly. In his after-action report, Reed noted, "The modified trigger performed exactly as demonstrated. This is the first time I've achieved first-shot kills at this range." Reed was not alone. By July 20th, the division had filed 43 reports mentioning the new triggers. The statistical shift was so dramatic it looked like an error. Before the modification, the first-shot hit probability at ranges over 400 yards was 38%. After the modification, it jumped to 76%. British sniper casualties dropped by half, while confirmed kills doubled. The most telling validation came not from British reports, but from the enemy. A captured situation report from the 12th SS Panzer Division, dated July 25th, noted a marked increase in enemy sniper effectiveness. A captured German sniper, Obergefreiter Klaus Richter, later told his interrogators something changed in mid-July. Before, we could usually survive the British sniper's first shot and relocate. After mid-July, the first shot was almost always fatal. We began to fear the British snipers as much as they feared us. Harold Bowman's geometry had reached out from a basement in Portsmouth and altered the physics of the battlefield. The tide in the hedgerows had turned, not because of a new tank or airplane, but because a civilian gunsmith had given British soldiers the ability to trust their weapons again. The ghost shift was real. The British sniper had transformed from a nuisance into a predator. By August 1944, the unauthorized experiment had moved from the hedgerows of Normandy to the killing fields of the Falaise Pocket.
Here, as Allied forces encircled and destroyed German Army Group B, the modified Lee-Enfields ceased to be a novelty and became a decisive tactical asset. The most striking proof came from Sergeant James Milne of the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division. On August 16th, overlooking a road junction near Trun, Milne and his spotter engaged German soldiers attempting to escape the encirclement. Over 6 hours, Milne fired 28 shots at ranges between 300 and 600 yards. He recorded 23 confirmed kills, an 82% hit rate that was virtually unheard of with the standard trigger mechanism. Milne later reported that the clean break allowed him to take shots he would never have attempted with a standard rifle, making previously impossible engagements routine. The success was so undeniable that it created a new problem for the War Office, a grassroots rebellion. Word of the Bowman trigger had spread through the ranks like wildfire. Snipers who hadn't received the modified rifles were frantically requesting them, and in some dangerous cases attempting to file down their own sears based on rumors of how the mechanism worked. The situation was becoming a safety hazard, not because the modification was dangerous, but because untrained soldiers were trying to replicate a master gunsmith's work. The military establishment could no longer hide behind safety regulations. The evidence was overwhelming, and the demand was deafening. The institutional surrender arrived formally on September 3, 1944. Major General Charles Keightley, commanding the 6th Armored Division, sent a direct request to the War Office demanding immediate authorization for the Bowman modification. His missive was blunt. Field testing demonstrated significant improvement with, quote, no reliability issues. The Small Arms School at Hythe was ordered to conduct an official evaluation, but it was merely a formality. By that point, the illegal rifles had fired over 50,000 rounds in actual combat, with 0 trigger-related malfunctions. The argument that the modification would fail in mud and cold had been disproven by the war itself. On October 12, 1944, the War Office officially authorized the Bowman trigger modification for production. In a final stroke of irony, the military establishment that had once dismissed Harold Bowman as an unqualified civilian was forced to hire him to teach their experts. Bowman was contracted to train military armorers in the precise geometry of his design. By December 1944, over 3,000 Lee-Enfield sniper rifles had been retrofitted. The forbidden modification had become the gold standard. The final accounting of the Northwest Europe campaign revealed the true magnitude of Harold Bowman's contribution. The statistics were stark. British and Canadian sniper sections equipped with modified Lee-Enfields saw a 68% reduction in casualties compared to the dark days of June and July 1944. The first shot hit probability at ranges over 400 yards had leaped from a dismal 38% to a lethal 81%. An estimated 340 snipers survived engagements they likely would not have walked away from had they been using the standard military trigger. These were 340 men who returned to their villages, married, and raised families, all because of a modification that cost 3 shillings and took 45 minutes to install. True to his character, Bowman never sought to profit from his invention. When the War Office offered to pay him for his time training armorers, he refused anything beyond his basic travel expenses, telling Colonel Campbell, "I didn't do this for money. I did it because men were dying." He returned to his quiet shop in Portsmouth, content to fade back into obscurity. However, the soldiers he saved did not forget. In 1947, a group of veterans from the 51st Highland Division, led by Sergeant William Reed, traveled to Portsmouth to find him. Reed told the gunsmith, "Because of what you did, some of us came home who wouldn't have otherwise. We have children now. That's because of you." It is reported that Bowman, overwhelmed, had to step into his back room to compose himself. The technical legacy of Bowman's geometry endured long after the war. When the British Army finally retired the No. 4 rifle and adopted the L-42A1 sniper rifle in the 1970s, the trigger mechanism incorporated the exact geometric principles Bowman had sketched in his basement. Even today, modern precision systems like the Accuracy International Arctic Warfare Rifle utilize trigger designs based on the same fundamental concept of leverage and engagement angles that Bowman championed. But the most poignant legacy resides in the archives of the Imperial War Museum. There, a file contains 127 letters written to Bowman by veterans and their families. One letter dated 1952 from a former sniper named Thomas Henderson reads, "My daughter was born last week. I named her Hope because that's what you gave us in Normandy." Such a small thing, such an enormous difference. Harold Bowman died in 1968, his obituary describing him simply as a respected local gunsmith. It failed to mention that he was the man who beat the bureaucracy, fixed the Empire's rifle, and gave hundreds of men the gift of a future.